Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into a book that's been generating a lot of buzz.
Oh, yeah.
Fransicko.
Yeah.
Why Progressives Ruin Cities by Michael Shellenberger. And it's a book that tackles a very complex and a very sensitive issue. Homelessness.
Yeah.
Particularly in cities known for their progressive policies.
It's a hot button topic for
Yeah.
sure. And Shellenberger, he doesn't shy away from controversy.
No, he is not.
He argues that a lot of these policies, while well-intentioned,
Right.
are actually making the problem worse.
Now, before we get into the specifics of his argument, I think it would be helpful for our listener to get a little background on who Michael Shellenberger is
Okay.
and what led him to write this book.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's
Yeah.
always helpful to understand, where the author's coming from. So Shellenberger, he's got a long history of involvement in social and environmental issues.
Yeah.
He's kind of an interesting guy. He's an environmental activist turned social policy critic.
Right.
So he's been writing and thinking about these topics for decades.
He's not just some random guy with an opinion.
No, he's got skin in the game.
He ran for governor of California in 2022.
Right. Exactly.
So this shows his deep engagement with these issues.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that he actually started out as a strong advocate for progressive causes.
Oh, wow.
But over time, he became,
Disillusioned.
disillusioned with what he saw as the failures of progressive policies, particularly in San Francisco.
So he's coming at this from a place of experience and perhaps a sense of disappointment.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
He clearly feels that the progressive movement has kind of lost its way and that its policies, while often well-meaning,
Right.
are actually causing harm.
Yeah.
And he lays out this argument very clearly in the introduction of the book where he makes a pretty startling comparison.
Oh, you mean where he compares the way California is handling its estimated 100,000 unsheltered residents,
Yes.
many with mental illness or addiction, to the mistreatment that occurred within mental institutions of the 20th century.
That's the one.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful statement.
Yeah.
And it sets the stage for the rest of his argument.
It does.
He's essentially asking, have we really made progress in how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society?
And it's a challenging question, and I think one that a lot of people are grappling with today.
Yeah.
Now, one of the first myths that Shellenberger tackles in the book is the idea that homelessness is primarily driven by poverty and the high cost of housing.
That's a common assumption.
Yeah.
And it makes sense on the surface, right? Cities
Yeah.
are expensive, wages haven't kept up, so people end up on the street.
Right.
It's a narrative we hear a lot.
Yeah. But Shellenberger challenges that assumption head on.
Right.
He uses a few interesting examples to make his point.
Yeah, like,
Well, he points to cities like Palo Alto
Right.
and Beverly Hills, which have some of the most expensive housing in the country.
mhm.
Yet, they don't have the same scale of visible homelessness as San Francisco.
Right, it's a good point.
So if it's not just about being poor or being priced out of the housing market, then what is it about?
Right.
What does Shellenberger see as the missing piece of this puzzle?
He introduces this concept of disaffiliation, which might be a new term for some listeners. It refers to a sense of estrangement, isolation from friends, family, and community.
Okay.
It's essentially a breakdown of those vital support systems that most of us rely on.
So it's not just about lacking material resources, it's also about lacking social connections and support networks.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
The challenges that many homeless individuals face.
And Shellenberger argues that this disaffiliation is often linked to other issues like addiction
Right.
and mental illness, which further exacerbate the problem.
And this leads him to his critique of the housing first approach,
Yeah.
which has been widely adopted in many cities, including San Francisco.
Right. So Housing First is a policy that prioritizes providing housing to homeless individuals without requiring things like sobriety or treatment as preconditions.
Okay.
The idea is to get people off the streets as quickly as possible and then address those underlying issues once they are in a stable living environment.
It sounds compassionate on the surface,
Yeah.
but Shellenberger isn't convinced.
Well, he argues that Housing First, while well-intentioned, can actually worsen addiction and hinder recovery, particularly for individuals struggling with disaffiliation.
So in a way, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a bigger problem.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
He argues that simply providing housing without addressing the underlying issues of addiction and disaffiliation might not be enough to help people turn their lives around.
Right.
In fact, he suggests that it might even enable them to continue those destructive behaviors.
That's a pretty provocative argument, and I'm sure it sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah, a lot of people don't like that argument.
But he doesn't just criticize housing first, does he?
No, he doesn't.
He also highlights some alternative approaches that he believes have been more successful.
He does.
One example he cites is abstinence contingent housing,
Yeah.
which has been implemented in places like Birmingham, Alabama.
Right.
And how does that approach differ from housing first?
Abstinence contingent housing requires sobriety and participation in treatment as conditions for housing.
Okay.
So it takes a more tough love approach.
Mm.
But Shellenberger argues that it's ultimately more effective in helping people overcome their addictions and achieve long-term stability.
So it's about striking that balance between compassion and accountability, something that he seems to emphasize throughout the book.
Yeah, you've hit on a key theme here.
Yeah.
Shellenberger believes that we need to rethink our entire approach to these issues and move away from what he sees as a culture of enabling and towards a culture of empowerment.
That's a pretty significant shift in perspective.
It is.
But before we go any further down that path, I think it's important to address another major argument that Shellenberger makes in the book.
Right.
And that is the idea that San Francisco is attracting homeless individuals because of its permissive environment around drugs.
This is another controversial point and one that has garnered a lot of attention. Shellenberger suggests that San Francisco's policies, which are often seen as compassionate and progressive, are actually creating a magnet for people struggling with addiction.
Oh, wow.
He even uses the term pleasure island to describe this phenomenon.
Can you elaborate on that a little? What exactly does he mean by pleasure island?
He's using it as a metaphor to describe the perception that San Francisco is a place where you can use drugs freely without facing any serious consequences.
Okay.
He shares anecdotes from homeless individuals who have come to San Francisco specifically because of its reputation for leniency around drug use.
So he's suggesting that these policies, while intended to help people, might be having the unintended consequence of attracting more people to a place where they can continue these destructive behaviors.
That's the argument he's making.
Yeah.
And he uses this to support his broader critique of progressive policies, which he believes are often naive and fail to account for the complex realities of human behavior.
It's definitely a thought-provoking point and one that I think deserves further exploration.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
But before we get too deep into that, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another key aspect of Shellenberger's book.
Okay.
His critique of drug decriminalization.
Yeah, this is very timely.
Yeah.
Given the ongoing debates about drug policy in the United States.
In the U.S. and all over the world.
Everywhere.
Shellenberger takes aim at the growing movement to decriminalize all drugs.
Yeah.
Even hard drugs, like heroin, meth, and fentanyl.
That's a big one.
This is a really complex issue, and one that evokes very strong opinions on both sides. Can you give our listener a brief overview of the arguments for and against drug decriminalization?
Sure.
Yeah.
So those who support decriminalization argue that it would reduce incarceration rates, remove the stigma associated with drug use, and allow people to seek help without fear of punishment.
Okay.
They also point to the fact that the war on drugs has been largely ineffective and has disproportionately harmed communities of color.
Those are all valid points.
Yeah.
And I can see why this has become such a heated debate.
It is.
What's Shellenberger's take on this?
Well, he acknowledges that there are some potential benefits to decriminalization.
Okay.
However, he ultimately believes that it's a misguided approach that will lead to more harm than good.
What are his main concerns?
Well, he raises a number of concerns,
Yeah.
but one of his biggest fears is that decriminalization would lead to lower drug prices,
Okay.
greater availability, and ultimately increased use and overdose deaths. He points out that even in countries like Portugal, which have decriminalized all drugs, drug use and overdose rates have not gone down, as some proponents had hoped.
So he's essentially arguing that decriminalization doesn't address the root causes of addiction.
Right.
And that it might even make the problem worse.
That's a good summary of his position.
Okay.
He also worries that decriminalization would send the wrong message,
Okay.
essentially condoning drug use and making it seem less dangerous than it actually is.
That's an interesting point.
It is.
It's kind of like the debate over legalizing marijuana.
Yeah.
Some people argue that legalization has led to increased use, particularly among young people, while others maintain that it's simply brought something that was already happening out into the open.
Right.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It certainly is. And it's one that Shellenberger delves into in quite a bit of detail in the book, offering a nuanced and thought-provoking perspective that challenges both sides of the debate.
He also takes aim at some of the leading figures in the drug decriminalization movement, doesn't he?
He does. He singles out Ethan Nadelman, who is a very prominent advocate for drug decriminalization. Nadelman co-founded the Drug Policy Alliance, which has been very influential in shaping drug policy in the United States, particularly in progressive cities and states.
So Nadelman is a key player in this debate.
Yeah.
And Shellenberger clearly sees him as a major force behind the push for decriminalization.
A big player.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
What's his beef with Nadelman?
He's critical of Nadelman's influence, arguing that his approach has contributed to the very problems he claims to be solving. He suggests that Nadelman's focus on harm reduction, while well-intentioned, has downplayed the dangers of drug use and created a more permissive environment that's actually making things worse.
It sounds like he sees Nadelman as a kind of symbol of the misguided progressivism that he's critiquing throughout the book.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. Shellenberger views Nadelman as someone who's been very effective in advancing his agenda, but who, in his view, has failed to grasp potential unintended consequences of his policies.
It's interesting to see how he weaves together these different threads.
Yeah.
His critique of housing first, his concerns about drug decriminalization, and his broader attack on progressive ideology.
Yeah.
It all seems to be part of a larger argument about the need for a more balanced and realistic approach to addressing these complex social problems.
You're picking up on the overarching theme here.
Wow.
Schellenberger isn't just offering specific policy prescriptions, he's also trying to shift the way we think about these issues.
It's about challenging assumptions and questioning the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly.
And he does this by drawing connections between seemingly disparate issues like homelessness and mental health care.
Yeah, and that brings us to another major theme of the book, the mental health crisis and its connection to homelessness.
This is a crucial part of his argument.
It is.
And one that he explores in depth.
He argues that the deinstitutionalization movement, which began in the mid-20th century, has had a profound and largely negative impact on how we treat mental illness in America.
For those who might not be familiar with this, can you give us a quick explanation of what deinstitutionalization was all about?
Essentially, it was a movement to shift mentally ill individuals from large, often inhumane institutions to community-based care. The idea was to integrate them back into society and provide them with more freedom and autonomy.
So at first, these asylums were probably seen as a progressive step forward.
They were, yes.
A more humane approach to treating mental illness than what had existed before.
That was the intention.
Yeah.
But as Shellenberger points out, these institutions often became overcrowded.
Oh, wow.
Understaffed, and in many cases, inhumane. The conditions within these asylums often deteriorated, and they became places of misery and neglect rather than healing.
It's another example of those good intentions.
Yeah.
Paving the road to unintended consequences.
Exactly.
And this led to the deinstitutionalization movement of the mid-20th century, which aimed to get people out of these large institutions and back into their communities.
Yeah.
The goal was to provide more personalized care in a less restrictive setting. To reintegrate them into society, to give them more freedom and autonomy. This sounds like a positive development.
On the surface, it does.
Yeah.
And it was certainly driven by a desire to improve the lives of people with mental illness.
But, as we discussed earlier, Shellenberger argues that this movement, while well-intentioned, had some serious unintended consequences.
Yes, some serious unintended consequences.
Like what specifically?
Well, he believes that many mentally ill people were released from institutions without a plan for their care or a safety net to catch them if they fell through the cracks.
Yeah.
He argues that the community-based mental health system was never adequately funded or quick to handle the influx of patients.
Yeah.
And this led to many people ending up on the streets without the support they needed.
So we essentially swung from one extreme to the other.
Yeah.
From large, impersonal institutions to a fragmented and underfunded community-based system.
That's a good way to summarize it.
Yeah.
And Shellenberger argues that this has contributed to the homelessness crisis that we see today, particularly in cities like San Francisco, which have struggled to provide adequate services for the mentally ill.
And he ties this directly to policies in California,
Mm-hmm.
right? Specifically, he critiques the Mental Health Services Act,
Yeah.
Proposition 63,
Yes.
which was passed in 2004 with the goal of expanding mental health services.
Right.
You're right, he does.
It was hailed as a major victory
Yeah.
for mental health advocates at the time. It
Mhm.
brought in billions of dollars in new funding for mental health programs.
Why does he say that it hasn't been effective?
He argues that a key flaw in Proposition 63 is that due to legal restrictions,
Yeah.
none of the funding can be used for involuntary treatment.
Oh, wow.
So even if someone is clearly in need of help but refuses to seek it voluntarily,
Yeah.
the state has very limited options for intervening.
So it's another example of the tension between individual rights
Right.
and the need to protect those who might not be capable of making rational decisions in their own best interest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
California has very strict laws about involuntary commitment,
Okay.
making it extremely difficult to force someone into treatment,
Yeah.
even when they're clearly a danger to themselves or others.
And Shellenberger clearly believes that this has created a situation where many people who desperately need help are falling through the cracks.
He does.
Yeah.
And he offers several examples of individuals who have been failed by the system.
Yeah.
People who were in desperate need of help, but were unable to access it because they didn't meet the criteria for involuntary commitment.
It's heartbreaking to think about, especially when you consider the potential consequences of not getting someone the help they need.
It is.
And this leads Shellenberger to propose a rather controversial solution: the creation of a state-level mental health agency in California,
Right.
which he calls CalPsych.
Yeah, CalPsych.
This is one of his more radical ideas, isn't it?
It is.
Can you explain how this agency would work and what he hopes it would achieve?
He envisions CalPsych as a centralized agency
Okay.
that would be responsible for coordinating and overseeing mental health services throughout the state.
Okay.
He argues that this would help to streamline services,
Mm-hmm.
reduce bureaucratic hurdles,
Okay.
and ensure that people have access to the care they need regardless of where they live.
So it's about creating a more efficient and effective system
Right.
that can better serve the needs of the mentally ill. He believes that the current system, which is largely county-based,
Mm-hmm.
is too fragmented and inefficient.
Yeah, too siloed.
He sees CalPsych as a way to create a more unified and comprehensive approach to mental health care.
Mm.
It's a bold proposal,
It is.
and I imagine it would face significant challenges both in terms of funding and implementation.
For sure.
But I can see how he sees it as a necessary step towards addressing the mental health crisis that he believes is at the heart of many of the problems we're facing, not just in San Francisco, but across the country.
It's a nationwide problem.
It's a complex and interconnected web of issues.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate how Shellenberger is trying to connect the dots
Yeah.
and show how these different problems are intertwined.
He's trying to see the whole picture.
He doesn't just focus on mental health, though, does he?
No, he doesn't.
He also delves into the issue of race and criminal justice
Mm.
and how these issues intersect with his critique of progressivism.
Yeah, he dedicates a significant portion of the book to exploring the issue of race and its impact on the criminal justice system, particularly in the context of his critique of progressive policies.
This is obviously a very sensitive and important topic.
It is.
How does he approach it?
Well, he starts by acknowledging the very real problem of systemic racism in America.
Okay.
He doesn't shy away from the fact that people of color, particularly black men,
Right.
are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement and are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and incarcerated than their white counterparts.
Okay.
He presents data and statistics that back up these claims.
So he's not denying the existence of racial disparities in the criminal justice system.
No, he's not.
Okay.
He clearly recognizes that this is a serious problem that needs to be addressed.
However, he also pushes back against the idea that all disparities are a result of racism.
Right.
So he's saying that while racism is definitely a factor, it's not the only factor at play.
He argues that we need to be careful not to oversimplify complex issues
Right.
or to jump to conclusions about the causes of these disparities.
Okay.
He suggests that other factors like poverty, lack of education, and involvement in gang activity also play a role.
Right.
And he argues that we need to consider all of these factors if we want to develop effective solutions.
So it's about taking a more nuanced and holistic approach.
Yes.
Not just focusing on race as the sole explanatory factor.
He's cautioning against what he sees as a tendency within progressive circles to view everything through the lens of race.
Right.
And to assume that any disparity is evidence of racism.
Okay.
He argues that this kind of thinking can actually be counterproductive because it can prevent us from seeing the full picture and addressing the root causes of these problems.
He's walking a tightrope here, trying to acknowledge the very real problem of systemic racism, while also pushing back against what he sees as an oversimplification of the issue. And this is where his critique of the religion of progressivism comes back into play.
Right.
He worries that this mindset, while well-intentioned, can lead to a kind of moral absolutism that makes it difficult to have honest and productive conversations about these complex issues. So instead of fostering open dialogue and debate, it creates an environment where people are afraid to express dissenting views for fear of being labeled as racist or insensitive. Ultimately hinders our ability to find solutions.
It does.
Because it prevents us from having those difficult conversations that are necessary to make progress.
Right. We need to be able to talk to each other.
He makes a similar argument in his critique of the defund the police movement, doesn't he?
He does. He acknowledges that police brutality is a serious problem and that police reform is necessary.
Okay.
However, he's critical of the defund movement, arguing that it's overly simplistic and fails to address the root causes of crime.
So he's not opposed to police reform.
No.
But he thinks that simply reducing police budgets is not the answer.
He argues that we need to look at the broader societal factors that contribute to crime, such as poverty, lack of opportunity, and the breakdown of families and communities. And he believes that simply reducing police presence in communities might actually make things worse by creating a power vacuum that leads to more violence.
He offers a specific example of this, doesn't he?
Yeah.
His analysis of the Capitol Hill Occupied Protests, or CHO, which took place in Seattle in the summer of 2020.
Yes, he devotes an entire chapter to the CHOP, which was a protest zone that was established in Seattle following the murder of George Floyd.
Protesters occupied several city blocks, demanding police reform and racial justice.
It was a very intense and controversial time.
That was a really intense and controversial period.
It was. And the CHOP became a flashpoint in the debate over policing and race in America.
It did. And Shellenberger uses it as a case study to illustrate his concerns about the unintended consequences of progressive policies.
He does.
What are some of the key points he makes about the CHO?
He argues that while the protesters' demands for justice were valid, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. He believes that the city's leadership, particularly the mayor, failed to adequately respond to the situation, allowing it to descend into chaos and violence.
And didn't that situation end tragically with several people being killed?
It did. 2 young black men were killed during the occupation. And Shellenberger argues that these deaths were a direct result of the city's failure to maintain order and protect its citizens.
So sad.
It is a tragedy.
He sees this as a cautionary tale about the dangers of what he calls pathological altruism, doesn't he?
He does.
This idea that good intentions can sometimes blind us to the potential negative consequences of our actions.
Exactly. He believes that the city leaders were so focused on appearing compassionate and accommodating to the protesters that they failed to take the necessary steps to ensure public safety.
And he's also critical of the police response, isn't he?
He is. He argues that the police, after initially withdrawing from the area, eventually responded with excessive force, which further escalated tensions and contributed to the violence.
So he's not letting anyone off the hook here.
Nope.
He sees faults on all sides.
He sees it as a collective failure.
He believes that the CHOP was a perfect storm of bad decisions, misguided policies, and a lack of accountability, which ultimately led to tragedy.
A very sad situation.
It's a powerful and disturbing example.
It is.
And it serves as a microcosm of the broader issues that he's exploring in the book.
Yeah, it's a good case study.
He's not just offering critiques, though, is he?
No, he's not.
He also proposes some solutions, some ways to address the problems he's identified.
He does.
And his solutions are just as bold and controversial as his critiques.
They are.
He argues that we need a fundamental shift in how we think about homelessness, mental illness, and addiction.
Right, a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
He believes that we need to move away from what he sees as a culture of victimhood
Okay.
and towards a greater emphasis on personal responsibility and accountability.
That's a pretty big ask.
It is.
How does he think we can achieve such a fundamental shift in thinking?
Well, he starts by advocating for a change in language.
Okay.
He believes that the term homeless is itself problematic.
Why does he think that? It
Why?
seems like a fairly straightforward term.
He argues that it lumps together a very diverse group of people with very different needs and challenges.
Okay.
He suggests that we need to be more specific in our language, talking about people with mental illness,
Okay.
people with addiction issues, people fleeing domestic violence,
Right.
rather than just using this broad catch-all term of homeless.
It's about recognizing the individuality of each person, their unique challenges and their potential for growth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he thinks this shift in language can help us move beyond the simplistic narratives of victimhood and blame and start to see people as complex individuals capable of making their own choices
Right.
and taking responsibility for their own lives.
It's a subtle but potentially powerful shift in perspective.
It is.
And he doesn't stop there.
He doesn't.
He also gets very specific in his critique of San Francisco, particularly the Tenderloin district,
Right.
which he uses as a microcosm of the larger crisis facing the city.
The Tenderloin is one of San Francisco's most troubled neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And Shellenberger argues that it's become a haven for open drug use and lawlessness, driven by the city's permissive policies.
He's very critical of the harm reduction approach that's been adopted in San Francisco, isn't he?
Yeah.
This idea that you can minimize the negative consequences of drug use without necessarily trying to stop it altogether. He thinks that in the case of the Tenderloin, the harm reduction approach has actually enabled drug use and made the neighborhood less safe for everyone, including those struggling with addiction.
He thinks it's made it worse.
He's advocating for a more tough love approach,
He is.
setting clear boundaries and holding people accountable for their actions.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Welcome back to our deep dive into San Francisco.
We've covered a lot of ground in terms of his diagnosis of the problem. He doesn't shy away from bold ideas, and he's not afraid to go against the grain of conventional thinking.
Right. I know he talks a lot about the need for a shift in our cultural mindset.
You're right. He sees cultural change as essential to addressing these issues. He argues that we've become too focused on victimhood and have lost sight of the importance of personal responsibility. He believes that this mindset is pervasive, not just in San Francisco, but in American society as a whole.
And this is where his critique of progressive ideology comes back into play, right? He sees this focus on victimhood as a product of what he calls the religion of progressivism.
Exactly. He believes that this worldview, while often well-intentioned, has led to a culture of enabling and a reluctance to hold individuals accountable for their actions. He argues that we need to rediscover the values of self-reliance, hard work, and personal responsibility if we want to create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
So it's not just about changing policies.
No.
It's about changing the way we think about these issues.
It's a change of heart.
But how do you go about shifting a culture? That seems like a daunting task.
Yeah, it is. Shellenberger doesn't offer a simple solution, but he does suggest a few starting points. He talks about the need to promote positive role models, to celebrate success stories, and to create a culture that values resilience and grit.
He also talks a lot about the importance of language, doesn't he? I remember you mentioned his critique of the term homeless.
Yes. He argues that the term homeless is too broad and impersonal. He suggests that we should be more specific in our language, talking about people with mental illness, people with addiction issues, people fleeing domestic violence, rather than lumping everyone together under this one label.
It's about seeing people as individuals with their own unique stories and challenges, rather than just as a faceless mass.
Exactly. And he believes that this shift in language can help us move beyond the simplistic narratives of victimhood and blame and start to see people as complex individuals capable of making their own choices and taking responsibility for their own lives.
It's a subtle but important distinction.
It is.
And he applies this same principle to other areas, like drug addiction. He argues that we need to stop thinking of addicts as helpless victims and start treating them as capable individuals who can overcome their challenges with the right support and motivation.
He's advocating for a more empowering approach, one that recognizes the agency and resilience of those struggling with addiction. He believes that this is the key to breaking the cycle of addiction and creating lasting change.
It's a challenging message.
For sure.
And I'm sure it doesn't sit well with everyone.
A lot of people would disagree.
But I think it's an important one to consider. We've become so accustomed to thinking of certain groups as helpless victims that we've sometimes forgotten their inherent capacity for growth and change.
That's a good point. And Shellenberger's book is, in many ways, a call to rediscover that capacity, both in ourselves and in others.
It's about shifting our perspective, challenging our assumptions, and being willing to see the world in a new light.
Exactly. And that's ultimately what makes Fransicko such a thought-provoking and important book. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question our own beliefs, and to consider new and innovative solutions to some of the most pressing challenges facing our society.
It's not an easy read, and it certainly doesn't offer simple answers.
No.
But it does offer hope, a belief that things can get better if we're willing to change our thinking and our approach.
And that's a message worth hearing, regardless of whether you agree with all of Shellenberger's conclusions. He challenges us to move beyond the blame game and the simplistic solutions and to start working together to create a more just and compassionate society.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Fransicko.
Okay.
It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey, and I hope our listeners have gained some valuable insights from this exploration.
I agree. It's a complex and challenging book, but it's one that I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in understanding the issues we've been discussing.
If you're intrigued by what you've heard today, I encourage you to dive into Fransicko yourself and form your own opinions about Shellenberger's arguments.
Yeah, check it out.
It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it, and it might just change the way you see the world.